Gun rights advocates have a good election night, but gun control advocates notch a few bellwether wins down ballot. All this and more on the news update.
No, the devil's got no hold on me.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the news update. I'm contributing writer Jake Fogleman, joined as always by Reload founder Stephen Katowski. TheReload.com, of course, is where you can head on over today to sign up for our free weekly newsletter. It'll keep you up to date on all things happening in the world of gun politics and policy. This week's episode is also brought to you in part by The Dispatch, but more on that at the end. Obviously, this week, the big news is that we just had a massive election. We have not all of the results in quite yet, but certainly at the top line level, we now know that former President Donald Trump will be retaking the White House and that Republicans will be retaking control of the Senate. We don't quite know the exact majorities just yet, but it's a safe bet now that they're at least going to hold what looks like 53 seats in the Senate. And projections are suggesting maybe a slightly increased narrow hold of the House. And that's where things stand as we record currently.
Yeah, technically, we don't even know if they have the House yet. It seems that way, but the most calls of any of and look, we use. At least I use, obviously most places will go to the Associated Press is the standard for calling races. And so they're very reliable on that. The New York Times also has, I think they use a lot of AP data, but they make their own calls as well. And then Decision Desk HQ, which is more of a more recent startup that's been around for a couple election cycles and has been very reliable. They collect their own vote reporting data. Separate from the AP, so they're like another separate organization that is doing similar work, and they also make their own calls, and they tend to be in some ways a little more aggressive usually. Although right now, interestingly, there's a little bit of a divergence. We won't focus too much on this because it could change even before this gets posted later today, as we're recording this. But right now. The Decision Desk has Republicans at 52 with two races outstanding, one where Democrat Gallego leads the Republican Lake in Arizona, and one where the Republican McCormick leads the Democrat Casey in Pennsylvania. Now, Decision Desk has called Nevada for the Democrat there, the incumbent. And the AP has called Pennsylvania for the challenger, the Republican challenger McCormick there, but they disagree a little bit on that front. So we don't know what the majority is going to be like in the Senate yet. It could be 52. It could be between 52 and 55 technically. It looks like it maybe is going to end up at 53. I think that's the most likely. But we don't know. Same thing for the House. Decision Desk has already called 216 Republican races. The AP and New York Times have called fewer than that. But I think they both show, as the races stand right now, where people are leading, that Republicans are likely to hold the majority and very slightly expand their on the 220 that they had going into this election. Very, very slightly. Actually, the Decision Desk has them yesterday, I think up till, I went to bed last night. They had them at like 221, which would only be a one seat increase in their majority. And now they're at 222 is the projection, right? Again, these are uncalled. Technically, we don't know. The Democrats could hold on to the House if everything went their way. It's unlikely that that's going to be the case. I think they've only Decision Desk has only called like 204 for the Democrats at this point. So they would need to sweep almost all of the remaining uncalled races, and that's probably not going to happen. So you end up with a Republican trifecta in the federal government, which is, as far as top line results go, right, is a good news for gun rights advocates, because that's the party that they're the coalition with, right? They're part of the Republican coalition. Republicans are sweeping back into office. They're going to have control of both chambers of Congress. Most likely, it will be pretty narrow control, it looks like, but control nonetheless. And so that makes a lot of things possible. We will, of course, look at more of that on the interview podcast with Cam Edwards, kind of get into what the realistic possibilities are for gun policy in the next Trump administration. But for now, I think we'll just focus a little bit on the race itself and some of these outcomes and how the gun groups did, because there is some more interesting stuff in here, right? First off, we can talk about the spending, right? You wrote a piece in the lead up to the race about where these groups are spending their money, right? And then I just put together a brief overview of how the big races went. Can you just give us like a little recap of that?
Sure. So obviously we reported well throughout the election cycle that gun control groups were outraising and in aggregate outspending groups like the NRA and its fellow travelers in the gun rights movement. But just by top line results, obviously the NRA had the better night, just by the nature of, like you said, the gun rights movement is part of the Republican coalition. The Republican candidates swept to power. It was sort of a little bit of a mixed bag. A couple of their candidates didn't get across the finish line, but the gun control groups, I say all the money that they invested,
they had a much worse night.
They had a bad night. They made a big play for a lot of these battleground Senate races, particularly in the House as well. They were really putting a lot of their eggs in the House basket because that was obviously a little bit more.
Although we should note there that a lot of those races are still uncalled.
Right.
So, we don't fully know the results of we're talking here about the very top money races that these groups were involved in. But we don't have an outcome for every single one of them yet.
Yeah, no, that's a fair point. But certainly just the top line takeaway is that they had a bad night. They were issuing statements, essentially admitting that they had a bad night. A lot of their preferred candidates went down. And that's sort of, there's a couple things you could probably take away from that. It's perhaps not what you'd expect, considering the money discrepancy. Traditionally, we've seen the gun rights movement be much more of a powerful force and being able to get these folks over the finish line. But there's also the fact that guns, how much can we really say guns mattered in some of the outcomes of these races? So I think that's the interesting part of this.
Yeah. There's definitely there's a lot more interesting going on here. And we're definitely going to talk a little bit about how much guns played a role in all of this. But just to give, and also some of the caveats here in the overall picture of this race, but just to give you some of the top line takeaways, right? The NRA, their biggest bets, almost all of them paid off. They were 8 for 10 in their top 10 races that they as far as outside expenditures, right? Now there's a lot of other ways that these groups have influenced the race beyond outside expenditures, like spending on ads and things like that. That's what we're talking about here. But, if you look at the Open Secrets reporting on Federal Election Commission data, the NRA, the 8 of the top 10 races they spent in went their way, with the possibility of it being 9 with Carrie Lake if she does end up coming back to win that race. That's one that's still undecided. The only one that's decided that they lost was Mike Rogers in Michigan. It's the Republican Senate candidate there. He lost, obviously close race there, but he wasn't able to pull that off. The rest of their top 10, went the way that they were spending, obviously including their biggest race, which was the presidential race, where they spent millions of dollars backing Donald Trump and attacking Kamala Harris. So, some of this, again, is kind of like by virtue of Republicans doing well, the gun rights groups and the NRA in particular did well. How much is because the NRA was helping them and how much was just because the Republicans were going to do well anyway is obviously a more open question. There's a lot more interpretation there, and we'll get to some of that. But I will say, once you go down the list a little further, the NRA's performance starts to drop off a bit, where they did not have as much success in the overall races where they spent more than $50,000. They only got about half of those right. So, if you're thinking they had a perfect record, that's not true. But their biggest bets paid off. I think that's how to look at the NRA. And then kind of the opposite. You go down the list and look at Everytown and especially Giffords. But Everytown, they did noticeably worse in their top 10 races. 4 went their way. 3 went the other way. And then there's still 3 California House races that haven't been called, that were part of their top 10 spending destinations for this cycle. So, they actually did a little bit better when you get down to after their top 10, because they got essentially 2 more wins and 1 more uncalled race, when you include all the races they spent more than $50,000 in. So,
right. It's much more of a darker picture though for
the top
Giffords,
line
right?
Stuff. Oh yeah, Giffords got demolished. I think that's fair to say. First of all, Giffords only made really big bets, and they didn't make a lot of them.
Right.
So they spent more than $235,000 in every race that they were involved in with outside spending, and but they only did that in 8 races, and all the ones that have been called, which there's 6 that have been called so far, and Giffords is on the wrong side of all of those. And they have about $2.2 million tied up in 2 more in a race, 1 race in California, 1 race in Arizona that is in the House that haven't been called yet. So they definitely took bigger swings as far as like trying to reach in some of these, especially House districts that they're trying to take back control of the House, and they just did not do well in that regard. So, the Giffords one is the clearest, which is that they didn't perform well at all. Whereas, and you can see this in the quote, we have quotes from all these groups. NRA is obviously very happy and celebrating the outcome of the election, and Giffords and Everytown are pretty despondent in their fundraising pleas, that are sort of double as almost therapy messages to their supporters. But the outcome there is pretty clear, though. I think the bottom line is like the NRA did really well overall, especially in its biggest bets, and Everytown and Giffords didn't.
Right.
Though there was a little more nuance as you get further down the line.
I was going to say, Nat, there's some caveats in that kind of folds in some of our other stories of the week, is that in the few races where guns were direct bellwethers, there were some interesting alternative results, right? We talked about, obviously, we have a story about the Colorado gun control referendum, which was the only ballot measure across the entire country that actually directly dealt with guns. And that looks like it's already been called as passing. And by about 9 points. And then we also talked about the Jared Golden House race in Maine heading into this election, because he famously changed his position on assault weapon bans. He was sort of one of the few, what you might call a pro-gun Democrat left in the House up until the Lewiston shooting last year. Came out in support of an assault weapon ban for the very first time. And that was like one of the centerpieces of the ads that the Republican challenger was running against him. And it looks like he's going to be reelected to that seat. So 2 things that didn't go the way gun rights advocates hoped, despite having top line success in other key races.
Yeah, that's one area that provides some more nuance to all this, right? Because the top line stuff, very good for gun rights advocates, because you're going to have a Republican trifecta in control of the federal government, and that gives you a potential for legislative opportunities and certainly a lot of potential for executive actions that favor gun rights activists or the gun industry. But at the same time, when you look at these races, most of them were not centered on guns. Gun policy was not a major issue in this election necessarily. It may have been a defining issue for some significant portion of the population, but it wasn't a top issue as we saw in polling throughout the race and also in the exit polling, which didn't even mention guns at all in any of the exit polling that I've seen. But the other factor to look at too is the very small number of races that did center on gun policy. And really, there are only two big ones. The ones you just mentioned, Colorado and Jared Golden, they both went against gun rights activists. They both went for the gun control side. Although I will say, I guess the Golden race is kind of interesting because the gun control groups did not try to help him, right? The gun rights groups went after him, and Republican groups used his flip-flop on an assault weapons ban heavily in advertising, and he tried to counter that with his own sort of pro-gun messaging, apparently effectively. But Golden pulled off that win. It's going to be a very slim margin there, but it's already been called by, I think, both the Associated Press and Decision Desk. Although I don't think the New York Times has called it yet. There's some possibility that some of these things will change as we get further out. It's unfortunately some of these places, Arizona, California, Alaska, and then even like places that have most of their votes in the trickle of the absentee ballots and things of that nature will take a while before we really have a full accounting. That's one of the reasons I waited a little bit, at least, to try and write my piece on examining some takeaways from this election. Because and even my pieces and even this conversation we're having needs to have a lot of caveats because there's still a lot of uncalled races. This is a very strong win for Donald Trump. That much is clear. He's probably going to win the popular vote for the first time. He swept the battleground states. Maybe, there's still pretty close margins there. He's only sweeping most of the blue wall states by a point and a half. So, it's not necessarily like a Reagan-esque landslide or something, but it's a strong win for him. That's pretty easy analysis off the bat because while there will be millions more votes coming in for that, it's not going to change the outcome of any of those races. Whereas at the next step down, the Senate and the House, the takeaway gets a little more muddied because Republicans took back control of the Senate, but right now it looks like perhaps they will only win one of those battleground Senate seats. They took back control of the Senate by winning the red state Senate seats from incumbents, to mind you, like in Ohio and Montana. So that's not an easy thing to do necessarily, and West Virginia as well. But it was something widely expected to happen, and they didn't. They may not pull off any of these reach states outside of probably Pennsylvania. We'll see with Arizona. That's remains to be seen how that will come out. And technically, Nevada hasn't been called by everybody yet either. But personally, I think a lot of whether it's Decision Desk or the Times or the Associated Press, I doubt many of those races are going to get uncalled in the end. They just are fairly reliable, those three, as far as calling races go. They might not all call them at the same time, but rarely do you get any of them uncalling a race later on. But, there's recounts. I think the Golden race is going to go to a recount. It looks like always some possibility that some when the races are that close, that there's some slim change will alter the outcome. But regardless, there's and then you get to the House, and I mean, if they really only pick up one or two seats in an election where Trump swept the battleground states at the top of the ticket, that's an odd takeaway from the race. It's just tempers some of the how much you take out of it, beyond Trump himself being able to garner more votes personally than his party is able to garner, below him, even when he's on the ticket. So I don't know how, and obviously the makeup of those two bodies is going to matter for the legislative side of any sort of gun policy agenda in Trump's next term here. So, but that's stuff we're going to get into more with Cam Edwards on the interview podcast. I will say that, the other thing to note, the top line's good for gun rights advocates. Those bellwethers on gun policy, they went the other way. And that is, that also complicates things a bit. Now, there's some caveats here, like there weren't a lot of bellwethers, right? There's only these two races. And the Colorado one, I mean, maybe you could speak a little bit more about the Colorado situation, because how much does it tell us that Colorado voters passed a new gun and ammunition tax, given, Colorado's political makeup and its leanings? Like, what do you take away from that? How much should people? It was the only major ballot initiative that dealt with guns, so it's what we have to look at. But what, how much do you take away from it?
Yeah, this is one where I don't think there should be too much read into it. One, Colorado is just a state that's trended far more blue over the last decade. It's been one of the gun control movement's bright spots legislatively over the last decade or so. I think there's been something like 20 gun control bills passed. So this is one of the few states where they're really racking up policy wins. Two, these sort of tax, some people sort of pejoratively call it a sin tax, but these types of measures tend to pass on the ballot in Colorado, even outside of guns. Like there was a nicotine tax that passed, I think, 2 years ago. There's just something about presenting to voters, hey, do you want to pass a tax that you won't have to pay, but this other maybe minority group, of consumers will have to pay? And you say, oh, it's for education, or, oh, it's for, in this case, crime victim services. That's something that appeals to voters, that maybe even if they don't have strong feelings about guns, they say, oh, sure, I can support that. So there's just, and some of the post-election analysis has shown all these districts across the country that have shifted right, obviously, because Donald Trump won. And Colorado was one of these blue island states where a lot of districts shifted to the left. So I just think there's all these factors that this was the outcome you probably were going to expect anyway. So there's not a ton, I would say, worth taking away in terms of attitudes to gun politics, because I think it's just sort of baked into the Colorado electorate.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's something where you would expect it to pass. The only thing I would counter with is, these gun ballot initiatives haven't performed that well historically, even in bluer states, right? We had one last during the midterms in 2022 in Oregon, right? Where they passed their gun control measure through a ballot initiative, but it only passed by like 1%. It was a tiny margin there. Now, it was a more aggressive bill in a lot of ways than this gun tax, because it banned possession of certain things like magazines that hold more than 10 rounds. So it was definitely a more consequential thing, and it didn't have the dynamic that you're talking about, which is like, do you want to tax on this thing that you are probably not going to buy anyway, in order to fund a thing that you like? Yeah, that is an interesting dynamic you see play out in a lot of places, I think. But that's the only thing I would say is right now it's winning by about 9 points. Now that is a little low compared to some of the other ballot initiatives in Colorado that have succeeded thus far. They've had a bit wider margins for some of the other successful ones, but 9 points is pretty good, especially when you look at how that Oregon one did, how universal background check ballot initiatives have performed in the past in places like Maine, where it failed despite the polling very well, generally speaking, and Nevada, where it passed, but only by the slimmest margin. So, there is something to be said about that, I guess. But you're right. I think there's a lot of caveats too, in that push in favor of the assumption that this was going to pass. This, Colorado is no longer a battleground state by any means.
Right.
It's only the second state to adopt something like this behind California. So it's maybe pushing a little closer to California than it is to Pennsylvania or Wisconsin or Michigan or Arizona or Nevada, like these battleground areas. It's becoming a bluer state over time. So but at the same time, you could also look at the golden race and ask the same questions. And that's a little more probably concerning if you're a gun rights advocate, I think, and reassuring if you're a gun control advocate, because that golden race, that district has been a battleground district since he was elected 2 cycles ago. This outcome seems like it's probably going to line up fairly close to that first election that he ran, where it was extremely slim margin for him to win the first time around. And then he expanded slightly in 2022. He did a little better. It was still very close there, a couple points. And then now looks like it's going to be less than a point between them. But that is more of an actual battleground area, right? And he still pulled off the win as of now, at least. Again, his opponent has requested a recount, so it will be a while before that'll all happen, likely. But if that holds up, and usually races that go to recounts, you still have the same winner at the end. But if it holds up, that means he pulled off a win when in a battleground area, when the top of the ticket in the election swept all the battleground areas.
Yeah. And he carried the top of the ticket, carried that district by 8 points, which it makes his performance even more impressive.
Yeah. So, it's just one of these things where you start looking a little bit deeper at this election, and there's a little more nuance to the outcome of it, generally, but also specifically on gun policy. And I think, the Colorado one maybe speaks a little less to where gun politics stands after 2024 as a standalone issue. But the golden race probably speaks a little bit more to that. And I don't know how much clarity it gives you. Like, Golden outperformed, as you mentioned, compared to Kamala Harris, but it was still razor thin majority there,
right,
for the incumbent. But his flip flop does not appear to have cost him his race, is the thing. Yeah. on an assault weapons ban specifically, which is the more aggressive part of the Democratic platform, or the most aggressive part on guns, at least, between the 3 policies that they generally run on: universal background checks, red flag laws, and assault weapons ban. But yeah, it appears it did not cost him that race. And so that is an interesting tidbit, an interesting takeaway. I don't know that, how much this matters for what realistic policy outcomes are going to be. I don't know. Obviously, like we said, the top lines are what matters the most. The Republican trifecta with Trump as president means very likely that gun rights advocates may not get everything they want necessarily. They didn't get everything they wanted in the first Trump administration, but they're likely to get a lot more of what they wanted than had the alternative gotten into the office, obviously. So, but one of the things that'll determine exactly perhaps what happens is how much Republicans read into and the new administration read into the degree that guns mattered for this outcome. And right. I guess that's another area maybe we should talk a little bit about. I think you're going to write a piece on this, but I don't know. As I mentioned earlier, the exit polls didn't mention it, whether that's because the pollsters didn't ask about it or voters didn't think to bring it up. I'm not positive on that front, but even if you look beyond the exit polls to the pre-election polling, guns were, as we've discussed a number of times, were not a top issue in any of the pre-election polling from any of the pollsters who asked about this. So, I guess the question is why? You can also see this a bit in gun sales, right? I wrote a piece this week on how gun sales declined in October compared to the previous year. So there was not a lot of motivation among gun owners to go out and buy guns because of this election. which sort of implies that they weren't worried about the outcome as far as, or weren't thinking about this, weren't worried about it as far as their ability to buy guns, even though there was a very stark contrast on record and policy between Harris and Trump on this stuff. I don't know. What do we make of this? Why? It sure seems like guns didn't matter a whole lot at the top, in these top races. So, why do we think that is? I mean, there was some discussion, obviously, between, there was, Harris talked a lot about her personal gun ownership and her Glock, and Trump talked about her record of backing confiscation efforts. And, the Harris lines seem to be a response to that as sort of a CYA move of trying to counter the confiscation attacks from Trump. But that didn't really seem much movement in polling as far as putting this issue higher in voters' minds, even with that conversation going on.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. I think a lot of it was just the extent to which the candidates talked about it sort of reflected the level of importance that at least pre-election indicators suggested it was on voters' minds, where it was sort of a tertiary issue that would get brought up. Like you said, it's sort of a CYA move for Kamala to talk about, I own a Glock. Don't worry, moderate voters that I'm trying to court. I do own a gun. Don't forget about when I previously supported a handgun ban, or I previously supported mandatory buybacks of rifles like the AR-15 right, and so forth. But there are also broader, I think, structural society-wide things at play. We tend to see, we've talked about this many times, we tend to see gun politics increase in salience when there's a high degree of either frequency of mass shootings or crime is on the rise, like it was in 2020 and 2021. Whereas in 2024, really the most high profile mass shooting was sort of the one that was, or high profile shooting anyway, was the one where Donald Trump himself was shot. And he didn't try to make that a gun politics story. And in fact, the story that he almost died kind of faded relatively quickly in sort of the maelstrom of the news cycle. And so it's just these fleeting moments that don't really capture the cultural attention, where guns sort of were allowed to fade to the background. And I think that speaks to perhaps why you don't see it in the exit polls. You don't really see it come up as a high salience issue for voters.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, I just think there wasn't a lot of attention on guns this whole year. There were not, mass shootings drive news cycles on guns. They're what bring the issue to a national salience most of the time. That's the reality. And we just didn't have a lot of them. We didn't have many of them at all. We really only had one this year, where 4 more people were killed. And that was the Georgia school shooting. And that also faded from the news pretty fast.
Right. And
didn't become a major part of the campaign. It did lead to some questions in the vice presidential debate, but that was about it. And so there just wasn't a focus on this stuff. And the Trump story, the Trump assassination attempt didn't become a gun story either. Like, he got shot by somebody using an AR-15, which has the potential to make it more of a gun story, but it just didn't become that. And Trump didn't change his positions on it. And Democrats, outside of a very brief period right after it happened, didn't really try to turn it into a campaign issue around guns. Their messaging was much more focused on trying to do like a rear guard against the idea that Harris was going to take people's guns away, or that she was too radical. A lot of her campaign was trying to do that on various different issues. And maybe that worked to some degree. She did better in the battleground states than she did in the rest of the country, as far as the shift from 2020. It just wasn't enough, clearly. She wasn't a good enough candidate, or the atmosphere was just too bad for Democrats. There's going to be a lot of talk about this stuff for the next for years, really, like there generally is after these kind of elections. But it just wasn't something that got national salience. And the closest thing was just this discussion about Harris's Glock, and it just didn't pique mass interest of voters ever. And I'm sure this is not to say that the issue didn't matter, or it didn't matter. It couldn't have been decisive in some of these races because they're relatively close races. I mean, these are, like I said, the battlegrounds, the blue wall states that, got a lot of discussion. They're going to come down to a point or point and a half, whatever, something like that. Most likely, once all the votes are tallied, it appears. And, at that scale of deciding an election, every little issue can matter, right?
Sure.
It doesn't necessarily mean that guns didn't have an impact. That Harris's record, for instance, the stuff that we reported on her time in San Francisco backing that handgun ban, that could have made a difference to a number of to 1% of people in Pennsylvania or Michigan or wherever. Just like any other of your issues that weren't necessarily top issue. The economy was the top issue that most people pointed to the entire race, right? Inflation. And you had things like immigration and abortion and democracy were somewhere below that. And then you get down to things like guns or crime or climate change or what have you. Like these things, even if they don't drive the election, they can still matter. That's all I'm saying here. I'm not trying to say that guns, that the work of the various gun groups didn't have any impact. It's just that it wasn't a top issue. It wasn't the main thing. It wasn't something that likely had the greatest impact of these issues. I think that much is just very clear.
Yeah.
And it's interesting. And I think that is, the question is why. And that is what you laid out there, I think makes the most sense to me. Just counterintuitively, we had a pretty good year on both murder, which was down significantly again, or appears to be down significantly again this year. And then mass shootings. We just didn't have a lot of mass shootings, and we didn't have a lot of, even if you, I guess I should clarify terms here, right? We talk about this on the show a lot, but 4 or more people killed in a single incident by a random attacker in public. That's the basic definition. The gun violence, or the Violence Project's definition is what I think is the most fair. There's not a perfect definition out there, but I think that's the closest to what most people think of as a mass shooting. That is where you didn't really have much going on. You had one. It's not really clear why, too. That's another thing. Maybe it's something we can explore more. Why did we not have many mass shootings this year? It's kind of strange because we'd had a pretty consistent level of these shootings, and maybe we'll have, unfortunately, more as the year ends. But they sort of can come in bursts and then lulls. It's not uncommon for that to happen with mass shootings, but it is a little bit uncommon to see it be 6 months between mass shootings. And there are other shootings that get attention that don't technically meet that definition. The Kansas City Super Bowl parade shooting is a good example of that, where there weren't 4 people killed in that, and it was more of apparently some sort of shootout rather than somebody intentionally trying to kill people at random. But that got a lot of attention because of the circumstances, and same for the Trump assassination. Obviously, thankfully, only one person was killed in that, but it was a politically targeted attempt to murder a presidential candidate and a former president. So it garnered a lot of attention. But none of these things stayed in the news for super long, and we didn't have a consistent drumbeat of mass shootings like people are kind of accustomed to seeing at this point. And so when that doesn't happen, I think it falls out of the national attention to a large degree. And that's probably why, coupled with everything else that was going into the election, all the other things that were happening, that pushed things down the list. And that's why You probably aren't seeing guns in the exit polls as a major issue. You aren't seeing them in the pre-election polls either. So
yeah,
I don't know. That's my. I don't know if you have any. You disagree with that at all, or
no. That's it. I'll have more to say to this, obviously, in that members piece that you teased. So members should check that out as I talk about it more. But I think that's essentially it. That kind of leads us into one of our headlines as we're wrapping up, because Jeff Asher has a piece in his great Substack. He does a lot of good stuff on crime, and he talks about sort of as murder has receded and over the last year or so, there's been sort of a partisan split in attitudes towards crime and views of how crime is doing. And you saw a dramatic drop in the number of Democrats and a slight drop, but not quite as much among independents in their view of how much crime is a factor. And so that obviously could play a contributing role as well into why guns weren't as salient. If half the country doesn't think violent crime is a problem, maybe they don't have to worry about, their gun vote. So I think there's something to that.
Right. And it's an interesting piece too, because it gets into this larger issue of partisan sorting in a lot of these polling questions. And a lot of perceptions, like the economy is a good one where it's less, there's been a whole long running debate about why don't people think the economy is doing better when you look at some of these markers over time. And, part of not all of the reason, part of the reason is that the view of the economy and how well it's doing has been highly polarized along party lines. So, if you go back to the Trump administration, Democrats thought the economy was doing much worse than Republicans did. And now you can look at they just crisscross as soon as the administration changes. It's almost certainly going to happen in January as well, where you're going to see a partisan crisscross again on how well the economy is doing, even if there hasn't been a huge change in the underlying fundamentals, right? And so you see that with a lot of things, right? Not just perceptions of crime or the economy, but all over the place. We talked about this back when we had an episode with one of the pollsters who did that NBC poll that found 52% of voters now report having a gun in the home. And he was talking through views on gun issues it's the same way there oftentimes, where gun ownership is less of an indicator about how you feel on various gun policies than your partisan identifier. Like if you're a Democrat and you're a gun owner, you're probably more likely to agree with a Democrat who's not a gun owner than you are with a Republican who's a gun owner, and vice versa. So it is fascinating to look at that data and how polarization has really taken hold and affected everything in how Americans view reality, really, or it's just it's an interesting bit. But what else do we have in the headlines?
Yeah, just the last headline we want to touch on is a nice tease for our interview podcast this week, because Cam has a piece over at Bearing Arms talking about one possible aspect of a Trump administration's gun policy, and how that relates to what positions the DOJ decides to take in lawsuits challenging anything from ATF regulations to enforcing the federal ban on felons possessing firearms.
Yeah, it'll be really interesting to follow up on that with Cam. People should check out that piece and then listen to the podcast once it's out for members on Sunday and everybody else on Monday. Of course, that membership gets you early access to the podcast. Also gets you the opportunity to be on the show if you would like to do a member segment. Love doing those. And then it obviously gets you access to the sort of members piece that we teased here that Jake's about to write up, as well as my own take on what is realistic to expect from the next administration with what we know of the outcome right now in the Senate and the House. That's a member exclusive as well. So you'll get access to hundreds of pieces like that and much more, as well as helping fund this operation, which we will continue to do here through the next administration. I think I had spoken a little bit about concerns over the things that Donald Trump has said or done in the past, and those remain. But I also committed to, I said the same about stuff that Harris had said, filibuster reform and changing the makeup of the Supreme Court, things like that were also dangerous to me. But not to rehash any of that stuff, I think it's pretty well established. But I also said, of course, that for us and for the Reload, what matters is our commitment to sober, serious firearms journalism and analysis. Like that's what we do here. And we're going to do that regardless of who is in office at what level or the makeup of Congress or whatever. That's my commitment to you guys. And so we will follow this new administration as aggressively as we did the current one. We've reported a lot on what happened in the Biden administration. We broke a lot of exclusives on the gun regulations that they were considering, the rules that they were considering making. We published leaked documents. We did a lot of things like that. We plan to continue to do that kind of work with this new administration. That comes first, the reporting and the analysis. My personal feelings on whatever politicians are out there. Frankly, I don't like many of them or maybe any of them. So, you can always take that as my baseline, but, that's all secondary. What matters is the commitment to journalism, to doing work, to recognizing, my own biases, as well as trying to articulate the truth as best as possible without favor to whatever side. That's, I think, our record of reporting shows that, and will continue to as we move forward here. And so, that's my commitment. I have principles. I think peaceful people should be able to defend themselves. I own guns. I build guns for fun. I'm a gun safety instructor, but these things may color my view of the world, but I try to approach everything as fairly as possible and give appropriate level of representation to the views that exist out there in this space. And I try not to, sugarcoat things or or shift reporting because somebody I like might be offended by it or something like that. That's just not in my headspace on when it comes to this commitment to informing you guys, the audience. That's what I care about above all else. So that's what we'll keep doing. Anyway, speech over. And I think hopefully we don't, election season's always fun in this regard. Maybe no more laying out of principles and speeches going forward. I don't know. I think you'll feel like you guys get it, right? You guys get where I'm trying to come from here. So I trust you people who are listening to be adults, and that my being open and honest about these things will hopefully leave you with a better understanding of what's going on, rather than trying to make you think the way that I think about whatever on a personal level. So, all right. Anyway, you have anything else to add, Jake, before we head out here? The Eagles are playing the Cowboys this week, so I'm looking forward to that. But I don't know who the Broncos have.
The Chiefs. We have big game, divisional game, and we always play the Chiefs pretty tough. So I'm actually really looking forward to this game. Even when we weren't good, we beat them last year. So I'm actually looking forward to this showdown.
Well, we shall see what comes with these games and what comes in the next administration. And for these final few months here, there's still stuff to cover in the Biden administration. And as it wraps up in the lame duck segment, there may be a lot of action that goes on as well. So we will keep on top of that too. All right. Well, that's all we've got for this week. We will see you guys again real soon. And make sure you check out that interview with Cam Edwards that will premiere for members on Sunday. This week, we're doing another ad swap with the Dispatch. We have a free 30-day trial over at the Dispatch for any Reload reader who wants to give them a try. And I think it makes a lot of sense because we tend to focus on the same things. Of course, the Dispatch has, in addition to reporting, a lot of opinion and analysis from big name folks you probably heard of. Steve Hayes, Jonah Goldberg, Ala Pundit. And there's a lot of guys over there that have been major players in the center-right conservative media space for a long time, and who I enjoy reading quite a bit. But in addition to their opinion and editorial work, they have a distinct focus on facts-first reporting, on hard news, in the same way that we do here at The Reload. And I think that if you like the reporting we do, if you like our approach, you will probably enjoy the Dispatch and their approach. And they're an even bigger publication than we are, with more resources, with a wider view, of course, of politics. They go into a lot more areas than we do. And so I think they're just a really good resource, and you should check them out. Sign up for that 30-day free trial. Give it a try. Been a paying member since they were founded, and I highly recommend them. So head over to the Dispatch today to check out what they have to offer. We have a link, of course, in the description and on our website to the 30-day free trial. So give it a try. See what you like.